This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
And this is Tommy Cathey from ForgeRock.
Today, we're going to talk about digital transformation and identity management. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. We're going to focus in today on digital transformation and identity management with one of the big dogs in the business, a company called ForgeRock, F-O-R-G-E-R-O-C-K. And we're going to bring in one of the leaders of that company. His name is Tommy Cathey. He's the Regional Vice President, Public Sector Sales for ForgeRock. Tommy, how are you?
Good, John. How are you today?
Good. Before the conversation, I found out you're in Texas, but you can be anywhere in the United States to know the federal government and how they handle identity. And I wanted to bring some information to my listeners on what ForgeRock can bring them and where they fit in the marketplace and together. And I went to your website. Tell you, very well done website. All kinds of information. So if you're working for an agency and maybe you have a little burp with your current solution, you're looking for other vendors, looking for solutions, you can go to ForgeRock.com. You will be bored to tears about federal information on that site. Did you jam-pack that stuff yourself, Tommy?
We did, John. I think as we look at what ForgeRock brings to the market, the public sector is our second largest vertical in terms of size. And so we have a big focus in the federal and public sector market here in the U.S.
I'll say. So one thing I did notice, and I want people at the top of the show to know this, there is a report out called ForgeRock Identity Breach Report. I think it came out in June. And if you want to grab something, shocking entertainment, grab that because all kinds of information in there. Good thing for people to download, isn't it, Tommy?
It is. It's absolutely. It's free of charge. It's a ForgeRock Identity Breach Report at ForgeRock.com. There's a lot of things in there that people I've seen in the past, but they just not have implemented it. So we publish this report every year, kind of where are the breaches coming. We are starting to see a pattern here all the way back to the pandemic. So I advise everyone, go out to ForgeRock.com and get access to that breach report.
Well, you brought up the topic IAM, Identity Access Management, and maybe 5 or 7 years ago, this was a niche conversation. Maybe me and Tommy at a conference somewhere would have coffee and talk about it. But I think what COVID did, it just punched this whole idea of identity management really to the forefront here. So maybe for our audience, a lot of companies know you. Tell us, our audience, what ForgeRock does and where you fit in the federal marketplace. Yeah,
thanks, John. So personally, I've been in the identity and access management space for almost 20 years, a little over 20 years now. So as you said, it was a niche market. ForgeRock, we are an independent software vendor. So we make and sell software, and a lot of that is for the federal government. And so we are really well known for our consumer or our citizen-facing authentication. And as you said, it has really transformed the last several years. You know, my adult kids are logging in from their phone. My mom's logging in from her phone. Everybody wants access to these consumable services. And now you're starting to see that in the citizen-facing services. So it's just a natural progression of what we do as ForgeRock to have these type of services within our federal customer base.
Tommy, I went to your Twitter feed this morning and looked at your last 6 months of tweets. Hashtag passwordless authentication. What are you doing here? You getting rid of passwords? What's the goal here, and how can this be used by federal audience?
I cannot stand passwords. I have to do it every day as a consumer. I know my dog's first name. I know the house I grew up with. I know my mom's maiden name. The only reason I know those things is because people have asked me for those when I have to authenticate. And we just don't want to do that anymore. It's called knowledge-based authentication, KBA. Those are a thing of the past. We as a vendor have embraced passwordless. We are a member of what we call the FIDO Alliance. That's FIDO. It's really easy. It's fast identity online. So the technologies are getting a lot better to consume to just get rid of passwords. So we are on a mission to say, you do not need a password anymore. Let's go fully passwordless. And we've embraced certain alliances like the FIDO Alliance to bring that technology to our customer base.
Well, I'm in the D.C. area, and first I go downtown and sit in the office of a CAO down there and talk with them. I know the words are going to pop up. It's going to be hybrid cloud. It's going to be identity management, and it's probably going to be something to do with zero trust. And these are the big leading conversation topics here. I've talked to hundreds of them. I know exactly what they're interested in. And this is a question I have about this hybrid cloud. I mean, I don't know if you follow the DoD, but there's a lot of awards that have been made lately. It's pretty much going to be a hybrid world for us, whether we like it or not. And so if you're a federal agency and you're using one or more cloud solutions, you may be in a situation where you have to repatriate, bring some of that back in. You may have a situation where some of your information is on-prem, some is in the cloud. I think this would throw a monkey wrench into the works of a lot of identity management solutions. It seems like that. I think that's really the challenge, complexity.
Oh, it is. I mentioned consumers and citizens, but we do in the federal government, we do mostly our workforce type authentications and identity and access management within that workforce. And so hybrid is going to be here for a while. We're dealing with legacy applications that have been around for decades. They're sitting in certain data centers. They may or may not be able to go to the cloud. We're also seeing new technologies come on in the cloud that have the ability to use newer protocols for identity and access management vendors. And then you also have federal customers that want to have their identity in a hybrid cloud. They may not be ready to go to a SaaS environment. They want to do a multi-cloud strategy based on those contracts that you mentioned. They want to be able to have choice between their cloud service providers or CSPs. So we've really embraced this DevOps world where you can take your identity wherever you want to deploy that identity as a federal agency.
I know. I saw that on your website. I read an article about vendor agnostic identity services. Wait a minute. Where do you fit? You fit in everywhere. How do you folks fit in with that?
We have customers across every cloud service provider that you publicly know, all the large ones. We're also in certain different types of environments that are across top secret, all the different environments of DoD that you can think of, different enclaves, different ships, different deployments. So we really don't care where we are deployed. We just want to be able to provide that agency the ability to have identity and access management in a container, and they deploy wherever they want. So that's a big push for us because we have one code base across the entire platform, and that's what people want. They want choice to where they can deploy their identity and access management.
When my kids were small, we had the dilemma of we wanted a van, but you wanted something good mileage and back and forth to know kind of car to get. And I think federal agencies have dilemmas as well. They may have systems on-prem that don't comply with new security requirements. And they may have hybrid systems that do comply with security requirements, so you get a situation where you have several different flavors of organizations trying to get into your identity access management system that I don't think many companies can handle that level of complexity. I mean, and then add to it scaling it. It's just, I think that's a conversation at a conference you have with someone over coffee. Is hey, guess what? It's really not working with our legacy systems. Can you handle legacy systems too?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to. We really like the complexity of the environments. We have some states that use ForgeRock for over 2,000 applications because they need to be able to provide that framework, whether you log into that application every day or maybe you just log into it once a month because it's payroll. We have to have that flexibility to handle all the different types of applications. What has transformed in the market is there was a first generation identity and access management market, and they were great for the applications that they had. Then 20 years later, now we've got scale, we've got mobility, we've got different type of security protocols, we've got different type of security mandates. And this frictionless, we want to be able to provide every user log in without friction, but you also have to have security on the back end. So it has moved over the last decade, where all users are authenticating, in billions of transactions a day just to get access to those services.
I cut my teeth arguing with software developers years ago, back and forth and arguing about everything. And it's legendary stories about these guys working all night long and coming up with solutions. So I always view it from their perspective of these people that really have to really integrate all the code together. And I think that one possible problem can be is bringing in a new app or changing an app or updating an app. Then you have to show that you can support it. You have to maintain it and have it in a test environment. When you said DevOps, you just mentioned that. I mean, it seems like flexibility is the word here. And if there's not flexibility in an identity solution, those software developers, it causes them a world of headaches.
Absolutely. Not only we talk about the flexibility of the applications, but what we're seeing in the market is the ability to orchestrate certain things. So as we look at the workforce in the federal government, there's the Common Access Card, or CAC, or the Personal Identity Verification Card called PIV. They're not going away. They're going to be here for a while, but now people want to be able to have flexibility in their authentication and authorization for those non-CAC and PIV users. And then what about one-time passwords, or what we call OTP? Here comes FIDO. Here comes SAML. Here comes WebAuthn. All these different protocols, all these different complexities, we want to be able to orchestrate that for the end user, where they can drag and drop a policy, drag and drop. Well, if John is on base and he's using his CAC, great. But when he's not on base, maybe he has a policy where he's using another form of authentication. Maybe his mobile device, or maybe it's a dependent that needs to authenticate. So it's just getting more complex as we dive into all these different use cases.
Well, Tommy, you're in Texas. In Texas, it's all about football. Maybe it's all about horses. It's all about something. In D.C. here, it's all about executive orders. And so people must stand outside the White House and just wait for the EO to come in and write it down and start memorizing and talking about it. But there's all kinds of executive orders. You probably are very familiar with them. And there's one that may or may not relate to your business, and that is user experience. If your solution's that good, how can it be fast? That's what people want to know.
Well, you have to be able to get users access to those systems as quickly as possible. Here in the state of Texas, we use a system called Texas by Texas for citizens to get their driver's license and vehicle registrations. We're in the millions of users. And so you have the ability to get to those services very, very quick once you have an infrastructure to do that. In the federal government, as we look at that digital transformation is what you see. It's how can you get access to those services in a scale, because everybody wants to be able to get access to those things as fast as possible. And so as you look at, a call to action is looking at how you can embrace FIDO, how you can get away from legacy type systems. The faster you can do that, the quicker you will be able to get those services to the citizens.
When I think of an image of Washington, D.C., I always think of some classical building with all these pillars, and that must have imbued itself on our federal leaders, because there's 6 pillars for this and 5 pillars, 7 pillars for that. First pillar is always identity. If we turn the tables and we talk to govies, companies that work with government, do software development, one of their pillars, and I think it's pretty obvious, is compliance. Well, that's fine. I mean, okay, you're fast, you can scale, good user experience. But hey, this is a check. It may not be a big check mark but this is a very big check mark. I mean, compliance. And guess what, Tommy? Some of these compliance regulations change. And so there's another aspect of flexibility. You got to juggle on a unicycle while going uphill. So it has to change too. So this is a daunting task.
Oh, it is. Identity is very challenging to some people that are new to the market. And if you look at Biden's new security strategy, the cybersecurity strategy from CISA and DHS, really a lot of it was voluntary in the past. And so now you're starting to see there's certain things that have shifted in the civilian world as mandatory. And really, as we look at more cybercrime, we saw increase in fraud during the pandemic. And now as we look at that zero trust strategy, as we look at that new cybersecurity strategy, identity is a pillar. It always has been a pillar, but to your point, John, everybody wants to call these things pillars now. I've never heard of that term. Yeah, the buildings have pillars, and maybe that's why they call them pillars. But we've really got to start looking at how we can stop using old authentication methodologies. Knowledge-based authentication is still prevalent today. Social Security. I still have some places where I have to put in my Social Security number as my unique identifier. We also have to start looking at ways to incorporate mobile into this strategy. Not everyone has access to a laptop anymore. So there's a lot of things that have changed that we have to embrace, which changes that policy, which changes that pillar. It's still identity, but all these new technologies are making it a little bit more complex.
Tommy, in town here, there's a podcast called Feds at the Edge. They just talk about edge computing, and we know there are feds right now in Hawaii. Guess what? There's feds at the edge out there, and they have to communicate securely. And if they're on a phone, they may not have a CAC card or a PIV card. I mean, may not be used all this. So I'm just throwing curveball after curveball at you. Here's another curveball. What about flexibility? What about at the edge? And is that still secure? How do you maintain security? Talk about a dynamic, changing environment. Let's fly to Hawaii, huh?
Yeah, it does. Unfortunately, that's such a catastrophic event where I would not want to be a first responder or a citizen or something trying to deal and trying to get access to those types of services. And so as we look at it in Department of Defense, for example, it's intermittent load, disconnected intermittent load bandwidth where they don't have connectivity. And they've been doing that for a number of years, where it could be a ship or some type of system that does not have connectivity. So we as a ForgeRock embrace that hybrid environment where you are local and you can authenticate local to those systems. And then when you are connected, then maybe you need to get access to an online application. And so Department of Defense have been doing that for a number of years, where they have contained those systems in a DevOps environment and they authenticate to those systems. Then when they're back online, they get access to certain other systems. So we do have to have that flexibility to be deployed in environments that unfortunately may not be connected all the time.
So Tommy, is that called decentralized identity management?
It's in the DoD, it's called DDIL, or intermittent load bandwidth, disconnected interload bandwidth. Decentralized is a whole nother topic that maybe we can say for another podcast with our CTO, who's one of the authors around decentralized identity. My opinion, that's more of a political challenge of certain states and how you're going to bring your own identity, whether you're a bank or you're a person in Texas moving to Maryland. How are you going to handle that policy? That is one hot topic I think I would say for another podcast.
Oh, boy, you have in-depth knowledge of this, don't you, Tommy? Wow.
I like to defer to others.
Yeah, well, I'm listening between the lines here. You're pretty good at this. Let's play a little Stump the Chump. In doing my research for this interview, I came across some terms that I may not be that familiar with. Maybe our audience isn't that familiar with. Maybe you can put it in perspective, or how you work with organizations like this, like identity proofing company. So is that you? Would you coordinate with them, or what's that all about?
Absolutely. No, it's a very good topic that we have to be able to do. As we look at ForgeRock, we're in the identity and access management framework for consumer, citizens, workforce. We are looking to get into the governance as well. We have some new governance tools coming out. We want one platform for authentication, authorization, and the management of those users and the governance of those users. That's our strategy. In addition to that, the ecosystem of identity and access management is growing leaps and bounds. One of them is identity proofing. So we have the ability to orchestrate whether you can plug and play out of the box, no development, no coding needed, your identity proofing vendor of choice. So if you wanted to prove who John was, all we do is in the orchestration layer is we point to those third-party vendors. Pick your vendor. And then we get a red light, green light. Is John who he is? We don't care what that vendor validated. If he's yes, then we allow them to go through that authentication journey. If they're not, we stop them in their tracks, because that identity proofing vendor gave us a red light. Whether it's Socure or ID.me or Onfido or Jumio, I'm plugging all the identity vendors. We've got integrations with all of them. They're great partners because federal agencies want choice and state agencies want choice to say, I may have this vendor now, or I may have this vendor later. We plug them into our ecosystem, even though we're not in the identity proofing space.
So does that work with something like maybe a point access management?
It does.
System?
It does. Without getting into the weeds too much, we can be the identity provider or the service provider, what we call the identity service provider. We can be both, but really from the identity proofing, it's more the back end type plumbing where we make an API call to one of those vendors, and they just tell us, is John who he is based on certain data, and then we let him in. So it all is a cohesive solution now than it used to be a point product 20 years ago.
Well, Tommy, you and I have been to a couple rodeos in our day, and it sure looks like this is becoming, a very mature topic. And there's issues like identity lifecycle management. I mean, these are topics that before COVID, no one thought of the complexity of this identification verification. It's getting to be just does Gartner have a whole separate world for this? I mean, this has got to be an ecosystem. You talked about this, that's building and building and building. It's getting out of control.
You're right. It is just, I think that's why this space is growing so fast, is ForgeRock is in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for access management. That's one subset of IAM. And here comes identity governance. And here comes identity proofing. Then here comes FIDO. Then here comes CAC and PIV. Here comes all these other different ways that you can authenticate. And so, it is, you have to be flexible to plug and play with all these different technologies and solutions. Our strategy, we're one of the leaders in access management. We have been in the identity management, provisioning, lifecycle management, self-service. I want to go in and change some attributes, my phone number, my address, whatever it may be. Then as we get into the governance space, I need the attestation of those users. Who gave John access to that application? And now people are getting audited for that. Why did John have access? Maybe he shouldn't have access. He's got access, but he hasn't logged in 2 years. You know what? Maybe we ought to revoke John's access to that application. So that is where we're starting to see that single framework, that single platform for access, identity, and then governance.
And so if you are flexible with APIs, you can incorporate 100 different agencies, 100 different solutions, where it's almost, I'm going to use the word modular here almost, where you can put in this module for that, another doesn't need that. And the military is going to be a whole separate world. And I'm just thinking that this business, the next conference in town, there's a conference in town that just handles this. It's coming up in September. When is it?
Yeah, it's the Federal ID Conference. It is sponsored by FCA. It is right after Labor Day, I believe the 6th and 7th of September. There's newer identity conferences popping up. I know there's one in the DC area in October. Identity Week is coming up. We had the Gartner Identity back in the spring. Then we had Identiverse. COVID kind of threw a wrinkle in all these different conferences, but you're starting to see a bigger trend in identity and access management specific conferences because this market has grown.
Yeah, the cloud is getting complex. Multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, private cloud, public cloud, repatriation, cloud native. These terms that, pre-COVID, there were maybe a select few could handle, but now everyone, I think even our listeners, has to be very familiar with some of the terminology in order to understand where ForgeRock fits in. So you're gonna force a prediction on you here. Nothing to do with football. It's got to do with federal security. So going to be what's going to motivate government leaders to get serious about this? And is it going to be another incident? Are they making progress now? Is it are the executive orders doing anything? Or does Tommy have to come up from Texas and start pushing people to get more aggressive about this? Or what's going to motivate our leaders to change?
I think the football question would have been much easier to pick the Super Bowl champion than it would be for this. I think it's both a carrot and a stick. There is a carrot out there. Funding has always been a big challenge. You put out the executive order. We have started to see more people allocate funding towards not only just product, but policies and process and people and how they build their identity framework. So that's more the carrot. The stick, I do believe you'll see more type of agencies. Not as much in the states as you do in the federal world. It will get some type of audit or some type of ramifications if they don't enable certain pillars within zero trust. I don't want to predict whether they cut off funding or how hard that stick is, or is it just it's a bad electronic mail that they get. I don't know, but I do think you will start to see a little bit more of a trend of hey, I need more funding to deliver these modern identity solutions. But if you don't, hey, you are going to get some type of a penalty. What that is and how they enforce it, that's always a big debate in the federal world. But I do think it's got to be both a carrot and a stick, and it's been that way for years, and I don't think that's going to change. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, as you well know, in this market.
Well, you've given our listeners a pretty good idea of different terminology and concepts involved in identity and access management. We appreciate it, Tommy. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilwright. I'd like to thank my guest, Tommy Cathey, Regional Vice President, Public Sector Sales at ForgeRock.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.